The important thing is that everyone remains in the same place whilst they're locked down, which is exactly what happened in the case you're referring to with Mr. Cummings. So the Prime Minister will have known he was staying put, and he didn't come out again until he was feeling better. I'll just come back to you.
But he did travel 250 miles from his London home, did he not? And again, to you and to Dr. Harris, you seem to be very clear about when people can leave their home, Dr. Harris. That is, for example, if they're seeking food, medical supplies, caring for the vulnerable. Let me give you one specific example. If someone is ill and the other parent is not at that time showing symptoms and they have a young child, should they leave their home when ill to go to another home 250 miles away? Is that in line with the guidance?
Sorry, I can go first. I'll go first. In the guidance says, if you're living with children, keep following this advice to the best of your ability. However, we are aware that not all these measures will be possible, depending, therefore, on circumstances. I'm adding those last few words. In other words, if you are in a position where you've got a young child, in this case 4 years old, and you are worried about the welfare of that child and your ability to throw around them the wider network of support, then clearly being somewhere where other members of the family can assist, by which I mean, in this case, younger other members of the family, then that might be the best place for you to settle and stay throughout the time that you're ill. And I think that's all that's happened in this case. Look, I think for everybody who's lost loved ones, everyone everybody has been impacted by this crisis, and everyone has done their best to try to do the right things. As I read out before, I won't repeat the guidance again, but it does essentially interpret it as taking practical steps to ensure that you follow the measures as best as possible in order to prevent, for example, in this case, a 4-year-old child from ending up without having the necessary support that a 4-year-old would quite obviously require. So that was the decision taken in that situation. And look, I understand what you're saying. I get what you're saying. Mr. Cummings is in the public eye, but the reality of the matter is that a 4-year-old child's welfare, I think, is the important thing. Parents will ask themselves what they would do if they had no other support around, and eventually you'd either have to turn to external support, not from your family, or try and be close enough to your family to provide that care, which is what happened in this case here. And I understand that his sister and I think a niece, who are from the younger generation, were able to provide food and bring things to the property they were staying in, which was not inside his parents' house. So I think it was a sort of a straightforward arrangement that meant he stayed in the same place and prevented possibility of the child in this case from not having support around him. And your second point was to Jenny.
Yeah, so I will reiterate probably what I've just said, which is the public health advice is take yourself out of society, if you like, as soon as you have symptoms. Stay at home with your family. I don't know the details of this specific case, and I'm commenting on the technical and medical advice. I think the point, I haven't got the detail of the comment from a previous press briefing, but I think the question I was asked was if two adults were ill and unable to cope or care for a small child who was totally dependent on them, was that a reason to seek external support? And I would just go back to say all of the guidance has a common sense element to it, which includes safeguarding around adults or children. So I think that would account for that answer.
Sam, I just want to give you a chance to come back.
Secretary of State, could you just clear up factually what went on? So Mr. Cummings went to a Durham property and he stayed inside that with his wife and child, all in the same property, and members of their family delivered food to their doorstep. Why did that necessitate that journey 260 miles? Why couldn't he have done that in London?
Well, I guess it's where his family was. Yes, those are the facts as I understand them, Sam. I guess the simple answer is that's where the family was. That's where the sister was. And the niece. So, as we all do in moments of crisis, we always seek to have our family, those who can assist us around us. And I think that's all that's happened in this case. I'm afraid I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know the personal circumstances, the extent of which support network could have helped where, but he clearly went to where the family was, stayed there, didn't then move around, and only came back to London for work, which is obviously allowed as one of the 4 reasons, when fully better and after the required period of time. Look, I think the reality is that people should, of course, follow the guidance. I won't bore you by reading it again, but it very clearly says you should follow the guidance to the best of your ability and follow the measures as much as is possible. And then it's for an individual to make the decision. How do I make sure I've got enough support around the family, particularly in the case that you're referring to, with a potential of both parents ending up being ill and having a young child to look after? How do you have that support network around them? And the decision here was to go to that location and stay in that location. They didn't then move around from there. And so it will be for each individual to work out the best way to do that, which is what's happened here.
You go as far as, if you had the symptoms, could you travel as far as possible to stay in a house closer to relatives?
No. I mean, as I already explained, you have to get yourself sort of locked down and do that in the best and most practical way. And I think that will be different for different people under whatever circumstances their particular family differences happen to dictate. That's all that's happened in this case. He was there, he stayed there, and I can carry on answering it, but it's the same answer each time. And there was a second point to Jenny.
Yeah, so, I mean, the key public health messages from a professional perspective are if people have symptoms, they should self-isolate immediately and stay in their homes. The only exception around this is around risk, and that's the issue of safeguarding for children or adults, and I think I've said that. In relation to the risk of travel, clearly in travel advice that we're giving, if you're in a private car, actually transmission within a vehicle, because it's an enclosed space and you're relatively close together, is probably a higher risk one, but you're usually if you're within a household group, then your exposures are usually the same, and if you travel from A to B and you're not meeting anybody else, then there's no possibility of a risk passing on.
I don't know exactly the answer to when the PM knew, but I know the PM knew that he was unwell and that he was locked down. Of course, the PM was also unwell during the same period in reference. I can tell you the PM provides Mr. Cummings with his full support, and Mr. Cummings has provided a full statement. And I think it's perfectly right that questions are asked, and you're all asking the same questions, and not, I appreciate, about the significant transport announcements of the upgrading of the A66 to dual carriageway and £1 billion to make people's lives better and faster to connect there, and I appreciate that. But I do think it's important to note that questions were asked, quite rightly, and the questions have been answered because Mr. Cummings has produced a statement which you will no doubt have read. And I think the second point was to you, Jenny.
Yes. So in the same way that as a doctor I wouldn't comment on the clinical position of an individual, I have no detail in this particular case, and I'm not going to comment on that. But in relation to the advice to the public, absolutely clear that public health guidance is if you're symptomatic, you stay at home, take yourself out of society as quickly as you can with your family and stay there unless there is that extreme risk to life. And that is a really important message. People have been really good at doing that, but it's vital that we continue to do that going forward because that also underlies the track and trace system as well. And we're going to be asking people to do that if they're identified as a contact.